Nehemiah chapter 6. We find ourselves in verse 15, but before we read through verse 15 today, where have we been? Who was Nehemiah? Now, I want to say that there is a common thread through the life and through the story of Nehemiah. We see in chapter 1 that Nehemiah was a cupbearer to the king. He was in a position of status and authority, keeping the king alive by eating his food before he did. He was in a comfortable spot. He was loved and he was respected. But some of his kinspeople from back home come and tell him about what is going on in Israel, in Jerusalem, how the walls were broken down, the gates were burned with fire. And what do we see from Nehemiah? He weeps. He is heartbroken for his people. He goes to God in prayer and he begs God to regather and restore his people. He puts together a plan. We see him go home. He inspects the need. He used the people of Israel to help build the wall. Now, during this building, Nehemiah faced mocking and ridicule for getting the work done. He dealt with slander and lies and attacks from his people and those perceived to be his allies, yet he continued to do the work. Nehemiah made sure the walls were safe and the city was safe from attacking enemies, but also from its people falling into forced poverty. And yet all the while he continued to do the work. Over the past 6 chapters, if we were to sum up anything about Nehemiah, through adversity, through difficulty, he continued to do the work that God had called him to do. You know, about this point, if I were Nehemiah, if I did this, and I could think of other things in my life that I was able to accomplish through hard work, you know, at this point, I would like to receive some of the credit for it. For someone to tell me that I did a good job. That isn't what Nehemiah was after, though. Verse 15 of chapter 6. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nation around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem. Why? For they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Why is that important today? Well, all this time, what we've seen is Nehemiah getting the work done, but in almost every chapter, we see Nehemiah going to the Lord for help, right? He's being attacked by people. He goes to the Lord. His people are scattered. He goes to the Lord. Something good happens. He gives credit to God. But even his enemies at the end, even though they were the enemies of God's people, what happened? They viewed God as the reason that it was accomplished. You see, all the while Nehemiah gave God the credit, but something strange is happening here. We see the people that were enemies of God giving God the credit. God not only got the credit from Nehemiah, but also his enemies. And I want to say this real quick, if we can pause. Isn't this the very definition of God receiving the glory? You see, the Bible from Genesis to Revelation is a unified story of God's deserving of and pursuit of his own glory. I want to say that again so that we get this, because if we miss this, we're going to miss a lot. That from Genesis to Revelation, the Bible as a whole could be summed up as God deserving of glory and his pursuit of his glory. No, the Bible is about God's redemptive story for us. Yes, that is a part of it. What are we supposed to do with that? We're supposed to give God the glory. No, the Bible is about God protecting his people, whether Israel or the church. Yes, God protected his people. Why? So that his people would give him glory. I think something bad happens when we read the Bible and we think the Bible is about me. No, I am the beneficiary of the grace in the Bible, but me receiving that grace is ultimately for the purpose of God receiving glory. Let's stop for a second and stop trying to put the attention on us. Nehemiah just led the people to build this impossible wall in 52 days. And yet he was satisfied in the fact that when it was built, the enemies of his gave God the credit. You know, I want to say this real quick. I think sometimes we think that God is on the ropes. We act like Christianity is really suffering and we're on the edge or we're on the precipice of falling into obscurity. Because it seems like that's how the world talks about Christianity, but what do we know? That ultimately God will receive his glory. Romans 14 verse 10 says, "Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God." Just Christians? No, everybody. Everybody will stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, "As I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God." So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God. Let's dwell on that for a second. Each person in this room is going to stand before God one day. Each knee in this room will be bowed before God. Each tongue in this room will confess that God is who he says he is. But understand something. Not only will every knee in this room bow to God, but every knee outside of this building. Those people that are actively trying to disprove God exists, guess what they're going to do one day? Their knees are going to bow and they're going to confess God as Lord. Those people that seem to be killing and attacking Christians right now, guess what? Their knees will bow and they will confess that God is who he says he is. We are not fighting a losing battle. We are fighting one that has already been won. And that is ultimately done by God. So then what is the goal in the Christian life if not to make Christianity survive? Well, the goal is what it's always been, is that we as believers get a head start. We give glory to God now because of what he has already done and what he has already accomplished. You see, the wall was finished, and the people of Israel and the enemies of Israel, they gave credit where credit was due, and that is ultimately to God. But then we pick up in verse 17 that the threat isn't quite over. You would think this would be the end of the story, right? The wall is done. That's why Nehemiah went there. That should be the end of the book, but it is not. Verse 17, "Moreover, in those days, the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah." Oh no. "And Tobiah's letters came to them, for many in Judah were bound by an oath to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Ariah, and his son Jehohanan had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah, as his wife. Also, they spoke of his good deeds in my presence and reported my words to him. And Tobiah sent letters to make me afraid." The wall is built. The gates are set up. This should be a victorious chapter. But what we see right here in verse 17 is that there were still threats within the walls. The threat was still present. You see, some of the people were communicating with Tobiah against Nehemiah. If this is one of your first weeks with us as we walk through Nehemiah, Tobiah was one of the bad guys. Tobiah against Nehemiah, against their own city, their own people, their own nation. You see, there were false brethren among their great men who favored, aided, and abetted the designs of their enemies. Why? Why would they do this? You would think they would have learned by now. Why would they be working against their people? Well, they were bound by an oath. They were indebted to the people that were against the reconstruction, which forced them to work against their own good. Let's pause there for a second. You know, I think sometimes when we read Scripture, we have this black and white view of the good guys and the bad guys, right? The good guys are the ones called by God to do the work, and the bad guys are the ones against it. But I think in some way, sometimes we miss that these are people. These are people with real struggles that we face every day. These people that were working against their own good. Why were they doing that? Because they were bound by an oath. They were enslaved to the consequences of a previously bad decision. Have you ever felt like you were enslaved to the consequences of a previously bad decision? Think about it, a decision that you had made maybe when you were younger that had ripple effects and consequences that you still feel today. Can we stop for a second and just empathize with these people? Hey, these people that look like the bad guys, I think in some capacity we've all been here. You see, I think this is a picture of how sin enslaves us long after it is conceived. You see, when we sin, we seek to enjoy the disobedience while unknowingly or willingly accepting the consequences that ultimately could last a lifetime. You know, I don't think that we see a better picture of this than King David. You know, if you don't know the story, later in David's life, this is after he had killed Goliath, he was already the king. And I'm going to paraphrase the story a little bit. David was supposed to go off to war and he didn't. His men and his generals and his armies were off at war and David stayed back. It's his prerogative, right? He's the king. He can do whatever he wants. And then one day, David goes out to the balcony. He looks off and he sees this woman bathing. Beautiful woman. And David stares and he dwells on her for a while. Until finally, David calls for this woman to be brought up to him. And at that moment, David had an affair. You see, that lust had led to sin. And then the consequences of that sin came up. Turns out this woman, whose name was Bathsheba, was pregnant. Oh no. His sin was going to find him out. So David came up with a clever plan. He was going to bring Uriah back from battle. He threw him a party and he told Uriah, you know what, Uriah, you should go be with your wife, thinking that if Uriah was with his wife, the sin would be covered up. He would think it was his kid. Uriah, being a frustratingly stand-up guy, said, it's not fair for me to be able to do this, and while all of our other men are at war, I'm going to stay in the barracks. I'm going to stay with my men. Oh no. David's foolproof plan to cover up his sin was foiled. So then he comes up with another plan. He sends Uriah back into war, but with directions for the general that once Uriah goes into battle against the enemy, they are all to back off and to leave him alone to his death. After Uriah dies, David marries Bathsheba. Obviously, his sin is covered up. He has gotten away with it. But it eats David away. And then we see him get confronted, and we see this in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 1. I'm going to say, if you don't highlight this, or you might want to highlight this. This is really good. Do what you want. It's your Bible and your highlighter. And the Lord sent Nathan to David. Nathan is a prophet, by the way. Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said to him, there are two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. And the rich man had many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought, and he had brought it up, and it grew up with him and his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms. And it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare it for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. So Nathan comes in and he tells David this story of this rich man taking this poor man's sheep. And how do you think David reacted? Then David's anger was greatly kindled against this man, and he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity." And then Nathan said to David, "You are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you the king over Israel. I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and you have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife." So what is Nathan saying here? Your sin is not a secret. Your sin still has consequences. The sword will never depart from your house. What did he mean by that? Well, first of all, this baby died. This baby that was conceived of that sin, that baby died. And if that weren't enough, one of David's sons sexually assaulted one of David's daughters. And if that isn't bad enough, another one of David's sons killed that son. And if that isn't enough, the son that killed the son that assaulted the daughter, guess what? He rose up against David, caused a war to break out within Israel. And if that weren't enough, that son also died. Guess what? That sin had ripple effects throughout David's life. You know, when David slept with Bathsheba, guess what? He probably didn't think that it was going to end in multiple of his children dying. Right? When David looked to abandon that child, he probably didn't think that it was going to result in that child dying. When David killed Uriah, he probably didn't think that would result in the damage and the destruction that came. Israel being plunged into a war with itself. His kids dying. Understand something, and I want us to get this today. That one sin had ripple effects throughout David's life. Nehemiah had built this wall for these people, but these people were bound by an oath to Tobiah. That oath may have been taken before Nehemiah even got there. He built the wall in 52 days. Maybe when they made that oath, they thought that it was just a small bad decision. Or maybe they thought that it was a hopeless situation, so what's going to happen? And yet they found themselves working against the guy that gave them some safety and security back. Sin can enslave you. You see, I think James gives us a roadmap to how sin destroys us in James 1:14. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. You know, I don't consider myself a fire and brimstone preacher. I try not to be discouraging as much as I can help it. But understand something, there is severity that we hear here. Right? You see, sometimes when we tell that lie, we don't necessarily think that that lie is going to have ripple effects through our life. Or when we make that one bad decision, or we look at that one thing, or we cheat that one person, we don't think that that has consequences past that moment. But what does James tell us? What do we see in the life of David? What do we see in the consequences of the people of Israel under Nehemiah? That sin or that decision will have ripple effects through your life. That one thing that you thought would just bring a momentary pleasure could bring lifelong destruction. I'm saying this to tell you to be careful. Not because I want you to try to earn your salvation. No, that is by the grace of God. Not because when you make a mistake that you fall out of love of God. No, God's love transcends the mistakes that we make. But understand something. God's love is able to cover a multitude of sins, but that doesn't mean that God won't allow that sin and those consequences to conform you into the image of His Son. If you have the choice to conform to the image of His Son through blessings or through the consequences of sin, choose through obedience to God and the blessings that come through that. Either way, God will receive glory. David lost his baby. He lost multiple kids because of the consequence of one sin, which led to another sin, which led to a worse sin, which led to his family being torn apart. That is how the people around Nehemiah were acting. How did Nehemiah react? He was obedient to God. Even though he was facing difficulty from within and opposition outside the wall, he responds in chapter 5 of Nehemiah, verse 19, "Remember for my good, O my God, all that I have done for this people." We don't see Nehemiah going to the people saying, "Hey, I want you to remember me well. Hey, I want you to give me accolades. Hey, I want you to tell me that I did a good job." I wish I was more like Nehemiah in this way. Because, man, I love it when y'all tell me good things. Where was Nehemiah's satisfaction? It was that he had favor with God. God, remember what I have done for these people. Nehemiah didn't want or need the approval of these people. He didn't want or need the approval of the people that were paid by Tobiah. He didn't want or need the approval of his enemies outside the wall. If he had favor with God, that was enough for him. Is that enough for us? Then we pick up in chapter 7, verse 1. "Now, when the wall had been built, and I had set up the doors, and the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites had been appointed, I gave my brother Hanani and Hananiah, the governor of the castle, charge over Jerusalem. For he was a more faithful and God-fearing man than many. And I said to them, let not the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot, and while they are still standing guard, let them shut and bar the doors. Appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, some at their guard posts and some from their own homes. And the city was wide and large, but the people within it were few, and no houses had been rebuilt." We're going to talk about this verse a little more next week also. But what do we see here? The wall was built and then handed off. Isn't that what Sanballat's accusation was against Nehemiah in the first place? That Nehemiah was building these walls and he was setting up prophets in these cities to say there was a new king, and that Nehemiah meant to use this fortress in rebellion against the king of Persia. He was accused of doing this work to build a kingdom for himself. But we see that when the work was finished, what did Nehemiah do? Nehemiah was willing to step away and to hand it to somebody. You know, when I was reading this, I was thinking about how this is a very difficult thing when it comes to the work of ministry. You know, I grew up at a church in Wilmington, Ohio. Now, I want to say this, Wilmington, Ohio, much more land and much less people, if that makes sense. You can drive somewhere that's 10 miles away and it takes you 10 minutes. It's amazing. I grew up in Wilmington, Ohio, small farming town, but there was a wonderful church there that we had grown up in. You know, that church started out in a storefront in downtown Wilmington. And the church grew and grew, and they ran out of room, so then they rented some office space above the storefront, and they turned that into Sunday school classrooms. And the church continued to grow. And then, because they were running out of room, they rented out an abandoned bank around the corner, and that was their office space to leave more classrooms. And it continued to grow to the point where they rented out the historic Murphy Theater, where they did plays and musicals in. And it was hot, but the church continued to grow. And then when the church was able, they bought a parcel of land outside the city, and they built a really awesome gymnasium that they put church seats in. And the church continued to grow, and then they built an addition, and then they built another addition. And if you were in Wilmington, Ohio, you would know what church it was. Even people that didn't go there knew about that church. It was a success story, except for one thing. After I had left the church and I heard other pastors talk about the church, there was a unified thing that was said. That church was built around the personality of that pastor. That if that pastor ever decided to leave, that church was going to fall apart. So even though the people in the church saw it as successful, people on the outside saw or thought that it was doomed to fail because it was built on the personality of one man. I'm happy to say this. That wasn't true. That pastor did leave, and my youth pastor took over that church. And he has done a wonderful job glorifying God, and that church is still there today, but there was the fear that it was built around one person's personality. Fast forward to Wilmington, North Carolina. I am the fourth pastor of this church. 35 years ago, there was a group of believers that wanted to see a work started, and they brought a man named Jim Finley to pastor Covenant Church. And then after a few years, Jim Finley left. And I'm going to say this, in a lot of churches that we see, if a pastor leaves within 3 years, the church usually or sometimes will fall apart. And yet it didn't. A man named Jeff Kennedy came in, and the church grew under Jeff Kennedy. Jeff was a different pastor than Jim Finley was, but they both loved the Lord. And then after a number of years, Jeff Kennedy left. And after having a dynamic person like Jeff, a lot of churches would fall apart, and yet this one didn't. It continued. A man by the name of Jim Davis came in. What I imagine very different from Jeff Kennedy. People were discipled, people were loved, and the church stayed and it grew. And then after 16 years, Jim Davis left. And then they brought in me, which was very different than Jim Davis, and probably different from Jeff Kennedy, and probably different from Jim Finley. And guess what? I am excited to be the pastor here, but sometime I could leave. I could be driving down the road while watching TV and get into a car accident. Could happen, not likely. God could call me away to a different place, but guess what? If we're doing the job right, then the church will continue. Why? Because it's not built on one man. No, people are to be discipled and to leave and to share the good news of the gospel. We, as a church, are supposed to glorify God, not the person standing behind the pulpit. Yes, I may help lead and teach, but we are in this together. Isn't this what we talked about last week? That if the church is built around that one person, that's where abuse and damage happens to the life of the believers. But when we all work together on this, then God will be glorified, and it won't be dependent on the personality of one man. Yes, Nehemiah did something big, but guess what? The people built the wall. Nehemiah didn't build the wall in 52 days. It was the people that did it together. And when the work was done, what was Nehemiah willing to do? He was willing to hand it off to the next person. Now let's talk about this next person that took over. You see, God sets you up to do a work, but the end result of that work is to lead well and to raise up leaders to take it over. But Nehemiah identified the right person to lead. Now how in the world could Nehemiah find the right person? What were the qualifications of that person? Well, to know that, we need to know why the Jews were in this hopeless situation to begin with. Nehemiah told us in verse 6 of chapter 1, let your ear be attentive. This is Nehemiah talking to God. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, here we go, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. You see, Nehemiah was a part part of a generation that had been in captivity for over 100 years. Why were they in captivity? If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. You see, Israel was carried into captivity because of willful disobedience to God. So who was the best person to take charge? Somebody that feared God. God would keep the nation safe and secure. Their end of the deal was obedience. So it was smart to put somebody in the position that feared and desired to be obedient to God. And not only that, Nehemiah found this person that feared the Lord, and then he gave that person direction and counsel on what to do. Use the gates that have been built. Protect what was built. You see, Nehemiah wasn't the only one that built the wall, so he installed leaders that wouldn't waste what was invested in. He wouldn't waste the wall that was built painstakingly. How do we apply this to us today? And we're going to dive into this verse again next week. We are doing the work together. Make sure the people leading keep safe what God has called us to. You know, we talk about it often in elder meeting, and I think it's true that we need to protect those seats of leadership. Not from different personalities coming in, but protect it from people that would use it for their own gain. That the people teaching and the people leading in the church, they should fear God. They should have a desire above anything else to be obedient to God. Yes, we are all doing the work together. You and the elders and the teachers and the leaders and me, we are all doing this work together. But what is your part? Make sure the people leading keep safe what God has called us to do. That's a big responsibility, and that takes all of us being on the same page, knowing what God has called us to. The question is this today: are we ready to give God the glory for when He does it? Are we willing to let off some of those shackles and those consequences that might prevent us from serving God and to serve God with everything we have? Are we willing to do all of that to the glory of God? If so, wonderful. If not, let's get that checked so we can move in the right direction. Every head bowed, every eye closed. No one looking around.